Yeah, okay. Um, all right, well, first of all, I wanted to say it's a real pleasure. I mean, I'm impressed as you guys went through the group and introduced everyone. I'm really impressed with the diversity of the people that are there and just the interest that everybody is showing. It's a real pleasure for us to be involved in this project. So I just also wanted to give credit to my other colleagues, and so a lot of the ideas that we're going to talk about here come from the others as well. So there's Dr. Clive Wellham, who's also a research associate in the Department of Forest Resource Management at UBC, and also a partner of mine in the Three Green Tree Ecosystem Services Limited. Then there's Dr. Peter Arcese, who also lives over in that area part of the time, and so he's interested in conservation. Stephen Shepard, whom you met, and then another Dr. Verena Grease, who's also in Forest Resources Management at UBC. Okay, so in general here, our goals are, hang on, I just wanted to move this thing around here. Okay, so I can see. Okay, the overall objective here is really to review the past management activities that have gone on in North Cowichan in the municipal forest area in the past, and try to learn more about that and kind of put it in a context of the region there, and think about how we can help the forest managers kind of understand what the community wants from the forest and how to kind of achieve those goals over the long term. So in order to do this, we're going to bring in lots of information with respect to spatial data, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And a big part of this thing, and that's the reason why we're here today, is really understanding the management goals of the community and helping to provide you with a way that we can evaluate the outcomes, right? And so are we actually doing and planning to do effectively to meet those objectives? So one of the tools we'll use is we use what's called multi-objective scenario analysis. And so we've been developing models at UBC for over 20 years now, looking at stand and landscape level management alternatives and how they impact the forest and how it changes over time. And so we'll use those tools, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk a little bit about the possibility of developing a forest carbon project as a way to generate additional revenue from a forest resource. And then finally, just kind of explain again how this whole process can lead towards a development of sustainable forest management plans for the area. Okay. All right. So just to give you a little context, the coastal Douglas-fir, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is this zone is quite rare in BC and really in all of Canada, and because it's an area that's quite desirable and it has a lot of privately owned land, it's one of the most imperiled forest types in BC. In fact, only about 3% of the original forest, pre-settlement, remains intact. That doesn't mean to say there's not other forest there, but once it's been harvested and changed, then it goes out of that characteristic. But I mean, there's still a lot of value in those second growth forests. And that's part of the goal of this project, is then to see if we can enhance those values. So the other point I wanted to make here is that obviously the North Cowichan Community Forest, from a conservation perspective, is significant with respect to this area, because it's a significant chunk of land there. Okay, so one of the things that we need to do to understand how to improve forest management here is we need to know about the what and the where of the forest. So one of the ways we can do that is looking at what we call spatial data resources. So it's just the spatial side of it just means so we can map basically where all these different features are on the landscape, and we can start to learn about how they interact with each other spatially and how they might change over time. So some of these mapping layers would include things like forest boundaries, forest vegetation types that can be stratified by tree species and stand age and other features. We can also look at where past management activities have occurred, so forest roads and blocks. We need to know about streams and water bodies, as they're important habitat areas. We also need to know about drainages, which, you know, when you're actively managing in a certain area, you can affect water quality. We need to know about that. There's also been some mapping of sensitive ecosystems and habitats in the area, and so we can bring that information in. There's been a recent study on visually sensitive areas, and we need to know where roads and trails are, and even some other protected and culturally important areas. And so we put all these data layers into our GIS system, and then we can do different kinds of overlay analyses, and it really helps us to understand how these things interact. And so I could go on with this for a long time, but we have spent a lot of time in the first part of this project really kind of assessing and developing the data sets that were there and kind of going through steps to verify them. Okay, so I'll start with just kind of a standard base map here. This kind of shows you where the actual forest reserve is located. And so all of you, many of you are quite familiar with this area, it sounds like. And so in general, as you know, the area is surrounded, is sort of built around the 6 main mountains that are there, and represents just right around 5,400 hectares. And, you know, the goals of the management in the past have really been multi-objective management, and there's been a significant amount of logging in the landscape with an allowance of up to 20,000 cubic meters per year. And in general, they haven't reached that amount in the past, but it varies year to year. Okay, so there's many maps I could show you, but I'm just going to show you a few in the interest of time here. So this one is what we call, it's one of the forest vegetation maps. And so this map shows an overlay of stand age class on just on an aerial satellite photo. And so what you see here is you can see the more yellowish colors are younger stands, and then the darker it gets is older stands. And so you can see there's areas where there's been harvesting in the past. Those are generally the younger stands, and then some of the areas that haven't been harvested obviously would be a bit older. And the reason why we're interested in age is because age is correlated with many other stand features that we care about from different perspectives. So we care about harvestable volume. We care about stand structure because it's important for habitat. Age is also related to biomass and carbon, and it's also tends to be correlated with many aspects of biodiversity. Okay. Here's another map. This one is just looking at species groups, and you know you can group stands or vegetation types in many different ways. This is based on an original one that was put together by it's a vegetation resource inventory map that was done by the province, and then we sort of took it and worked with the North Cowichan team to kind of modify it a bit and just update it. And one of the things you see here is that many of the stand types have Douglas-fir in it. They call it a Douglas-fir zone for a reason. There's a lot of Douglas-fir out there. It tends to grow in different kinds of mixtures with conifers and also with different kinds of deciduous species. And so we can keep track of kind of roughly where those different stand types are. All right. So as I mentioned, one of the things we need to do is we need to be able to verify these maps. So, you know, a lot of these maps already existed in different states, and they're not always the best quality. And so one of the things we like to do is to go through and just to verify them to make sure what the map says is there is actually there. And so there's different tools you can use to do that. One of the effective tools is to use these high resolution aerial photographs. And so we have some fairly recent photos of the land base. And what I'm showing here is 2 different panels. So one is a fairly zoomed in panel of a high resolution, what's called an ortho photo. And on the right side is the same exact area, but it's showing canopy tree height, which was measured by laser. And so basically the way they do that is they attach a device to a plane and they fly over the landscape, and they fire down these laser beams in very dense patches, and they measure how long it takes to come back. And from that, they can estimate the height of the land and the trees. And so we find it's a very effective way to see where the actual trees are and how big the trees are and where their crowns are and so on. And when we have that information about tree height, we can make inferences about tree age. And as I mentioned before, it's an important feature of the landscape. Okay, so I'm just going to keep moving along here to make sure we can get through there. Okay, so the next part I wanted to talk about is really how can we understand what the community wants from their forest, and we need to also develop a way to kind of evaluate outcomes. And so what we're really trying to get at is what we would call a sustainable forest management system that incorporates economic, social, and ecological features. And one way that we can do this is we use a system of criteria and indicators. And so the criteria would be things that you can use to define specific services and values associated with a forest resource, the things that you really want to protect. And then you also have specific indicators that are associated with these criteria, and these indicators can be used to evaluate the degree to which you've achieved your goals for particular indicators, or sorry, for particular criteria. And so I wanted to point out again that really the criteria part of this is really where we want to have this public engagement and public input. We need to know from you guys and the other people that aren't here but are interested, what they really care about in the forest. And so we can help them and work with the North Cowichan managers to really try to make sure we're maximizing the use of the forest to meet those values as much as possible. Okay. And so that's one of the things that we need to talk about. Okay, so I've got a list of things, and I know this looks quite daunting, but this was the kind of the thing I wanted to just put these here so you could kind of get a feel for the type of things that we're working with. And I expect maybe that you guys can look at these a little bit more later on your own, but I really just wanted to kind of point out some of the key criterion that we're working with, and also to stress that this is a draft set of criteria and indicators. These can be changed depending on input from people, right? So the first set I wanted to look at are what we would call the ecological indicators, right? And so this would include things like sensitive ecosystems, finding out where they are on the landscape and how much we're affecting them through our management. The second one there is protection and enhancement of mature and old forest features. So this doesn't necessarily mean old growth, because old growth is a difficult term to define many times. But even as forests age and develop, as I mentioned, there's a lot of other things that are positive about old and mature forests that we can enhance and protect. So we need to know about that. Bird habitat conservation is an important one. We have a lot of information about birds and where they are and what kind of habitats they use. And this is Peter Arcese's area of expertise. And he would argue also that if habitat is good for birds, it's often good for many other species as well. So we focus on that one. We also can look at ecosystem garbage and storage, and this is important for climate change and the role of a forest in mitigating climate change. We can look at water quality. Often when you disturb a forest area, you can influence the ability of the forest to sort of clean and purify water as it moves through the landscape. And then the last one is what we would call regional habitat connectivity, where you can then look at how the municipal forest relates to the rest of the larger area around there and how we can optimize that relationship. Okay, we also have economic indicators, and again, I'm just going to go through these quickly. So we can look at timber revenue that can be generated from the landscape and employment that goes along with that. We can also look at other sources of revenues, such as carbon offset sales or employment around these kinds of developing a carbon project. And clearly, many of you mentioned recreation, and recreation, just bringing people to the areas, can be useful for many other businesses, employment in the area. So we need to know about those. Okay, and then some of the key social ones we're interested in are visual quality. So we want to know, a lot of people like to see the beautiful landscapes, right? And so they don't like to look at square cut blocks, for example. So we need to have an idea of where these visually sensitive areas are and how forest management influences that. People are interested in recreation. We need to know about the types of recreation that are available under different kinds of management systems. So if you're very interested in a wilderness kind of experience, for example, then having a forest with lots of cut blocks and roads isn't necessarily the best. Trail access is important, right? Sometimes, just to play devil's advocate, the logging operations can generate revenue that can help maintain and support trail access. fire risk. So there was another person on here that was talking about the community wildfire protection plan, and so that's clearly things we can look at in terms of different kinds of fuel and ecosystem conditions that affect that. Culturally sensitive areas is another thing, and then I just mentioned other things here just to again reiterate the point that we're looking for input here. Okay, I'm moving along here. So one of the things that we want to do is then to create, bring all this together in what we call a multi-objective scenario analysis. So we bring all of our spatial data and our understanding about what people want and the criteria and indicators together. And then we can use these and put them into these modeling tools so that we can then make projections over longer periods of time to see what the different management alternatives might mean for some of the things that we care about from our forests. And so we'll have some different scenarios, and we can obviously, some of the scenarios, I wouldn't pay too much attention to the ones I have here. I just sort of put them up for interest, but we're looking for input about that as well, right? And so we might do one, often it's useful to do one, what if you just kept doing what you've been doing in the past and did that forward? That's a good kind of a bookmark, a bookend thing to look at. Could look at some reduced harvesting scenarios and other scenarios as well. And then output, there's a wide variety of output, and I could go on about that for a long time, but we're short on time, so I won't. But just to say that the models produce a wider variety of outputs that can be linked to the indicators and then ultimately to the criteria that we're interested in. Okay, so this graph here just kind of shows a way that we can take some of the model output and put it into this is called a polar pie chart that you can then use to express a lot of information in a quick sort of easily accessible chart. And so this is just a hypothetical scenario that with made up values, and it's just what if you had a scenario that was focused on maximizing harvest, for example, forest harvesting, and what it might mean for some of these different criteria, right? And so in general, the way to read these charts is you can see around the perimeter, you have the different criterion and their association with either ecological, social, or economic values. And then green just generally means it's very good, whereas as you get into the redder areas, it's poor, right? And so in this one, you would see the green is pretty high in the timber, revenue and employment area. Trail access is reasonably good, fire risk, but some of the ecological ones aren't necessarily as good here. Just to show an alternative kind of a thing, you could do a scenario that's maybe focused on maximizing conservation. So in this one, you can see the impacts that you see much more green in the ecological sector of the graph here, and more red and yellows in some of the economic components here, right? So again, I just wanted to point out that these are hypothetical scenarios, but this is a kind of tool that we can use to help explore outputs in a way that's accessible to a large variety of people. Okay, only a couple more slides here, I promise. So the last thing I did mention before about discussion of a forest carbon project, and this is an interesting thing that many of you have probably heard about and we've been involved with. It's a way of generating income from forests that as an alternative to logging, right? And so the owner of a forest can decide that they want to manage the forest rather than for producing timber or such. They can manage it to enhance and protect carbon stocks. And then if you can go through and you have to get a third party to carefully quantify and measure this and verify it, then once you do that, and you can then sell these things to buyers who want to offset their own emissions. And so this is done, there's many projects in BC and other places in North America and in Europe and beyond. So one of the studies we've done, we've already gone quite a long ways into it, is a study to kind of assess the feasibility of doing such a project on the North Cowichan Forest Reserve. And so we've looked at things such as looking at the spatial inventory data and evaluating key components and timelines and costs and revenues, and also talking to potential people who might be interested in helping to fund a project, or to even who would be interested in buying offsets that were generated from such a project. And so we've got a draft report ready. It's not ready for release yet, but it's one that some people are reviewing at the moment. And so that should be available in the near future. But just to say that the early results suggest that there is some potential to pursue such a project. Okay, then my last slide here is just that, again, just to point out that really the role of the technical group is to work with the North Cowichan team to help them kind of incorporate all the community concerns and bring in the data sets and their local knowledge of the forest and so on, and to bring that all together, and so we can do these scenario analyses and prepare some reports, and even prepare some what we would call decision support tools, which are little kinds of tools that you can use to say, for Sean, for example, could help to assess, you know, in the case where you have different kinds of wind throw events happening, and just to decide whether should you salvage this area or should you just leave it to let nature sort of run its course, right? So there's many different things you can look at from that perspective. And the last thing I'll finish on is just that we hope that we can work with the North Cowichan team to prepare some kinds of demonstration projects where people can see things on the ground and learn about what they look like and how they might change over time. And I know I went over by about 1 minute or two, so I apologize for that, but thanks for your attention.
Hey, that's wonderful, Brad. I love hearing you talk. Go